Hi everyone, mabuhay. Magandang gabi sa inyong lahat. We are going live. This is our first live stream for the year from Isco in Escasa, Melbourne. My name is Janica and I'm streaming from Cofield. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I'm streaming from. I'm from um, the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung and Bunwurrung country in Melbourne. So mabuhay sa inyong lahat, whoever will be watching us tonight. We have a guest speaker for tonight. She's a professor and historian from the University of New South Wales, Mina Roces. And we also have Rochelle Castro, who's moderating our live stream and looking at your comments, whoever's going to be watching tonight, and or any future comments that you may post using this feed. So yeah, let's start. So I'm going to introduce Professor Mina first, and before I do that, I was also going to say the title of our live stream tonight, which is Bagong Bayani or Bigong Bayani, and it's how global migration shapes modern Filipino society. So it came about when I did some research on Filipino migration or diaspora and came across one of the books from Australia, and it's authored by Mina. So here we go. Professor Mina Roces is a Filipina born in Manila, migrated to Sydney in the late 70s, and she's one of those what social scientists would call a one and a half generation immigrant. And she currently works at the University of New South Wales as professor of history in the School of Humanities and Languages. And I think she's also a deputy dean, if I understand it correctly. Mina, correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh, Deputy Head of School Research.
Deputy head of school, yeah.
Research.
And she describes herself as leading a mobile life. So she finished her undergrad in history at the University of Sydney, her postgraduate degree at University of Michigan in the US. Her first academic job was at the Central Queensland University in Rockhampton. It's classified as rural and remote in Australian lingo. So it was there where Mina first collected stories of Filipino women migrants for marriage who composed the majority of the Filipino community. And she was living there for 7 years in the 90s and then transferred to the University of New South Wales in Sydney, where she taught since 1999. She's a historian, so as I've mentioned, and published on 20th century Filipino women's history, and her own life experience as a mobile person has given her an empathy for the way the migrant archives interpret the past, whether it's the Filipino upbringing she has and her annual sojourns to the Philippines, which enabled her to appreciate the difference between migration of the diaspora and the viewpoint of the nation who are left behind. So let's welcome Professor Mina Roces or Dr. Roces, if we call what to call what you want to be called.
This is Australia, so my students call me Mina.
Mina.
Maraming
um,
salamat po.
and before we begin with Mina's question and answer, we also have our moderator for tonight, Rochelle Castro. So Rochelle is part of the executive team of the University of the Philippines in Victoria alumni Melbourne chapter, and she's a practicing lawyer in the areas of strata, construction, property litigation, insolvency, debt recovery, immigration law, and she's also founded RC and Co Lawyers. So she has a JD or Juris Doctor degree and is also completing a master's in construction law. She's a trainer, speaker in the strata industry, and she's also a committee member in Law Institute of Victoria. And she has graduated in UP Diliman in 2000. So you'll see Rochelle is very active in the strata and construction industry. She's been featured in magazines and newspapers online, as well as speaking about the updates on property and commercial matters. So her website is rccolawyers.com if you want to check it out as well. Hi, Rochelle.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited for this session.
So To anyone who's started tuning in and watching us, if you have any comments, we'll have a look at it, and maybe later on we can ask Mina to answer any of your feedback or comments about this topic. So again, our topic is Bagong Bayani or Bigong Bayani. It's about Filipino migration experience. Just want to share my screen. And it is, how can you share, can you guys see my screen yet?
Not yet.
No. Okay. uh, I might share it here. Is anything happening? If not, I will pull it back. Just want to mention that the title of our stream tonight is, yeah, Global Filipino Migration, and I want to put up Mina's book, but I can't share my screen, so we'll do that later. And if you check out her book, it's the title is I think as what it is, mentioning it as the Global Filipino Migration, um, Global Agents of Change. So you'll see that available online as well as in hard copy. So let's start and begin with the first question. Just wanted to start with something about the sources of your lived experiences or stories of migration, Mina. So you mentioned about migrant archives. Can you tell us a little bit about the migrant archives and how
Okay.
you came up with, telling all these stories in your book?
Okay. Magandang gabi po sa inyong lahat and maraming salamat for this wonderful invitation. And I'm honored to be here to speak to you, especially with all these accomplished women. Uh, um, First of all, I noticed if you read Filipino migration scholarship, it's dominated by social scientists. So I thought a historian could make a contribution. And when I discovered these migrant archives, because it's migrants are actually producing their own work, their own memoirs, their own life stories that haven't been tapped before, and they're in English, they're in Tagalog, they're in Italian. They're even paintings of little children in the Middle East. That's their story. Stories of Filipino domestic workers in Singapore writing about their romantic lives as single wives using pseudonyms. There's a lovely story about a domestic worker in the Middle East in Tagalog, all about the meaning of her maid's uniform, which made her look like a flower vase and invisible in the shopping mall. And there's even the life story of a Filipino American first generation migrant engraved in his gravestone in the Stockton, California cemetery. So I wanted to write a history of migration from the migrant's perspective using hitherto untapped sources. And these migrants are writing their stories because they want their contribution appreciated by the host country, which still sees them as largely invisible. We're the good migrant, so we never come out in the news. And also the homeland. Which in the 90s, I think in the 70s and 80s, those migrants who were left were considered traitors because they left the country, right? And then suddenly we're Bagong Bayani because of our remittances. So, it's shifting discourses. But these are coming from the government. I wanted to write the experience of migration from the migrants themselves, and people hadn't realized that they're writing their stories and publishing them. The Filipino Americans have their own archive in Seattle called the National Pinoy Archives. Domestic workers in Hong Kong combine all their journals because they want to publish in a book. So there are all these stories that I wanted to document about how migrants, you would all, since I'm speaking to an audience of Filipino migrants, my argument is everybody who leaves becomes a Filipino migrant 2.0, because you all had to adjust and change, and you reinvent yourself, mainly through the challenges faced by migration, hence the subtitle, which I'm happy to talk about too. The global agents of change. There's also all these migrant organizations who opened their archives to me, those who spoke up for advocacy. So some of these archives have never been used before. The Filipino Australian Medical Association that provides medical missions to the Philippines. I just went to their office and looked at their archives. So there's quite a lot of material that hasn't been tapped before.
Just gonna unmute myself there. Thanks, Mina, for that. I'm playing with a few features that we have in the screen. Sorry about the layouts that I'm trying there, but I want to
Yeah.
put Mina as the main um, speaker here. I so yeah, that no, that's all interesting points, and the concept of having these, I suppose, like a repository of all the experiences, lived experiences of migrants. Um, one of the things that really I appreciated in the book is how you've pointed out yung from a perspective of someone who lived overseas rather than, someone who's receiving on the receiving end.
Mhm.
So it's not easy to be a migrant, as we all
Yeah.
would know, and we all have our own story, and those stories enrich us as we go along with our lives and how we've managed to survive. One of the things that is in the topic I would like to start with is something to do with consumerism. It's have this concept of remittances. If you are overseas Filipino worker, or once you get out of the country and you found your way in a kind of like the greener pastures, so we would say, you're expected to send money home. And whoever, you're whether you're part of a rich family, or a middle class or poor family, you are expected to give something back. So but in return, a lot of these stories that I've read in your book doesn't really kind of cover what people, what the other the lived experiences people they've had. So it's great to have this documented. um just want to ask you about what you think about those migrants, for example, the ones in Italy. They, when they term kind of like use the term ubos biaya, how do you think they lived, or share these experiences with you?
Ah, okay. When people write about migrants and remittances, they only talk about the money that comes, remittances that help the country, or migrants as laborers, right? They work hard, but working uh, consumption is just as important to a migrant as earning a living. It's the reward for all the hard work you have, right? And sending those boxes to the Philippines is one way of connecting to the village. You haven't actually left it behind. You're still connecting. You're managing the you're changing the village by donating. There's some in little towns, you can see signs in the barangay hall that says this barangay hall was built by donations from Filipino migrants in Barcelona or Italy, and so on. So but on the other hand, the other side of it is that the Filipino migrants who go to the Philippines feel that they're expected to spend their money to show their status. So, in the one
Mm,
hand, they feel that spending the money will prove is a reward for their hard work, and it's also evidence that they're now middle class, right? Because the euros that they earn in Italy, when translated to pesos, converge to a lot. So they become middle class in the Philippines. But on the other hand, what happens is people expect so much from them and keep asking them for money. So the ubus biaya is they go home, they're greeted like celebrities, and then there's the pressure to spend the money, and then everybody wants to borrow money for them. So then all the money they saved is spent in just one visit to the
one go.
Philippines. So that is so the debt, as you raise that debt, becomes a major problem of a lot of migrants. And so now the government and NGOs have come up with financial literacy seminars. I attended two of them, one in
Mm,
Singapore and one for migrants, and one in the Philippines, because I thought it shouldn't just be as financial, telling the migrants to say no to requests for money, because I think it's very hard for us to say no. You're gonna be, walang hiya, and hindi, ostracized, and magtatampo, and the drama, right? So then they also have financial literacy seminars for the families to understand that the money that the migrant sends is everything that the migrant sends is a sacrifice that they won't have, right? They so I think when you talk about the consumption and ubus buhay, in one biyaya, in one sense, it's they can express their status as middle class, but on the other hand, it has this other side of it, which means it brings them into debt because the continuous requests for more and more, and people who borrow for them. There's that story you read about the seafarer who's, when he
Mm-hmm.
came home on a holiday, his wife was so worried the whole town would borrow money, and so she forbid him to leave the house. So they have to go to this kind of extreme. So there's that other side of it also, the expectation that they, or the perception that they must be so rich, and the money just grew on trees without the realization that these people are working really hard, and
Yeah.
everything that they spend is a sacrifice for their own. Some of these migrants don't have a retirement plan, or
Mm.
superannuation, or what do you call that, health insurance. So
Health
this, in the
insurance. Yeah.
financial literacy seminar, tells them, number one, you need to have health insurance. And I think there was even some seminars on how to say no, and I thought that was really really hard, because to say no to your family is, must be really hard for them. So they were taught uh, um, to come up with a budget, and to say that
Mm-hmm.
we're saying no because it's not within the budget, and not because it's a personal no.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting because I was just going to mention about seafaring because in your book you mentioned this, and I was just going to read some parts of it. So sabi niya, seafarers were among the highest paid dollar earnings in the group of overseas Filipino workers. And by 2001, their numbers increased to over 255,000, or around 28% of the global labor market. So, and by law, the Filipino seamen were required to remit 80% of their salaries to the Philippines. So these things I didn't know until I read your book. I'm like, oh, because I personally have experienced this somehow. My dad is a seaman, so I didn't know this. And I'm like, oh, that's a lot of money back then. So this overwhelmingly male group of consumers spent a huge percentage of their earnings on gifts. So it's become just like a default, like in that book, I think it's the archive is the Filipino seafarer, a life between sacrifice and shopping, and Maria
Yeah,
is poor in Paris.
yeah.
That's kind of like the headlines of their stories, which says a lot about what they've been through. um
Yes,
but
the
yeah,
Marie
no, it's
Square in Paris says the story of a woman in Paris who lives like a cockroach in the attic, but she has sent all her, her relatives back to school and things like that. And so you've got the sacrifice that they make to send back home is what appears very strong in the stories.
yes, yeah. um Is there anything in one of the archives that talk about how they've managed to survive and continue sending the money and make sure that they're still in that, stable position? Or has it just become like, we're just gonna do this over a length of time until until we die, or until
Ah,
we can do it?
well, the ones who go to the financial
Seminar.
seminars end up saving for themselves and learning. But you can see, when you watch Tagalog movies about migration, and there are plenty, it's
Mm.
always the migrant is suffering and sacrificing everything, and the family falls apart. Some of them has resonate, like the movie Remittances, based on domestic workers in Singapore, and Anak, of course, for them that's their favorite film. But when you read the stories, it's a story of a heroic narrative, what I called in the book, where it doesn't end in tragedy. So it ends in a triumph that they've survived the odds and done something for themselves. So you can see the subtitle of the book is Global Agents of Change. And for me, they've changed in several levels. So the first level they've changed is the level of the personal. All the migration stories that I've read record a change in their own life and a metamorphosis in their life. So, for example, the story of Zita Cabais, this is her real name, who was born in Pangasinan, the second of 9 children, to a poor farming family. She was forced to stop her schooling after completing sixth grade because her parents needed her to work to support her other siblings. So she worked as a maid in Manila, and then she got married and had kids in 1994 and went to France as an undocumented migrant to earn a living as a domestic worker. She was a nanny for 2 years and only received 2,000 francs out of a 6,000 franc monthly salary. So she was the first Filipina in France to file a case against her employer on the grounds of modern slavery. She wins the case. She becomes a celebrity in the Philippines and France. The first lady of France at the time sends her a letter. A television company follows her to the Philippines. The French trade union, the CFDT, gives her a job, which now helps other migrants in similar situation that she encountered. When she told me this story, she told it with an enormous amount of pride and self-awareness of her transformation from a domestic worker with primary school qualifications, to a union worker who advocates for the rights of all exploited workers in Paris and its environs in French. She writes letters. She had French lessons from the union. So you've got another story of cute Notello, who's a domestic worker in Singapore who joins the NGO Humanitarian Organization for Migration Economics. She gives testimony to the United Nations organization in a closed door session for the Convention on Decent Work for Migrants. So would these women have undergone these changes if they never left the Philippines? So that's something to think about. So that's one level. They change themselves personally. The other level is they affect the economy in the homeland. For example, because of their power, they have power as consumers. If you look at it this way, the Filipino channel, everybody who subscribes to the Filipino channel, I interviewed Rafi Lopez of ABS-CBN Global. He said to me that 40% of ABS-CBN earnings and revenue come from the Filipino channel from the migrants, more than 100 million. He told me the actual figure, but he didn't want me to put it in the book because of course, you don't want the rivals to find out. All these balikbayan boxes that we send every year to the family means that courier services now are make a lot of money. And the banking system has transformed. Banking systems are open on Sundays in Singapore because of remittances. They now offer financial literacy seminars. And migrants are not just consumers; there's also entrepreneurs. They're also investing investors in the Philippines. Real estate. The real estate boom in the Philippines is caused by migrants buying condominiums or building Italian villas in the provinces. And then on other level is you have an impact on the host country. So the Filipino Women's Working Party in Australia changed the migration law so that women victims of domestic violence will not get deported. And there's a serial sponsorship law which limits the amount of brides a man can sponsor, and that's because of Filipino activism.
I was
And then
just
of
gonna go to that
yeah,
point, Mina. Sorry to
yes.
interrupt you there.
Oh, no,
No, those are really
okay.
great examples. I kind of like hang on. There is so much in that examples that you mentioned. Because
Hmm.
we are here, but all we think about is, oh yeah, they're what could we make to make lives of the Filipinos back home better. But
Yes,
on the other hand, it's like we also have to look after ourselves and make
yes,
sure that
yes,
we are
absolutely.
in a good, I guess our well-being's looked after and all that, not just looking forward to the next um I guess event that we go home and spend all our money there, or just reunite with our families. But I was just gonna say, when it comes to the topic of activism that you mentioned and philanthropy, so that's something that is really it's a good segue, I guess, to find out how does these migrant communities affect the country they're living. It has setting that example that you've already started. Those women in Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland in the 80s who helped shape the migration laws for
Hmm.
especially for when that Filipino bride's visa was created. Can you tell us
So,
more
so
about that?
okay, I wanted to do a chapter on activism and in the host countries because then people normally don't think migrants or Filipino migrants can actually, because they're a marginal group, change the laws or change anything in the host countries, but they do. So the Filipino Women's Working Party in Australia changed migration law. So in the 80s and 90s, you have Filipinos married to white Australian men who have come here and have discovered that they were overrepresented as victims of domestic violence. So these Filipino activists who campaigned and worked with the Ethnic Affairs Commission of Australia. Of course, it was a time in the 80s and 90s when the Australian government themselves were interested in working and supporting migrant communities through the Ethnic Affairs Council. They gave grants and so on. So it was an opportune time, but you can see that Filipino migrants worked in collaboration with the host country's governments to change the law to help all marginal groups. So the laws that they pass is that you cannot, if you are a victim of domestic violence but you haven't fulfilled the 2-year permanent residency requirement, you will not be deported, and as long as you go to a shelter. If you They've also campaigned so that men, they've discovered that the Filipino victims of domestic violence were with husbands who commit, who were, what do you call that, serial, they had sponsored more than one bride, and these people became victims. So now there's a law where you can only sponsor maximum of two. So they changed that. Now I wanted to focus on activism on the most vulnerable, so I had women, and the other one was the youth. So my other example is Operation Manong at University of Hawaii in Honolulu, which was a affirmative activism group that tutored Filipino high school students to enable them to enter universities, because they noticed Filipinos were, uh, um, in terms of their population in Hawaii, were underrepresented in the universities, and so they did succeed in increasing Filipinos in the university. And now that organization has become adopted by the whole University of Hawaii as the Office of Multicultural Services. So that organization has now helps all marginal groups, not just Filipinos, Koreans, even Filipinos born in the US and second generation, and also Hawaiians. So that's how they've helped. In those two case studies, they have an impact on the host countries. uh, um, Filipino Americans have lobbied to have Filipino American, have October designated Filipino American History Month in the U.S. so that the Filipino migrant contribution could be appreciated there.
Yeah, I when I was in the US more than a decade ago, and I saw like on the road there's a turn where you could go to that area, the Filipino American I think country. I forgot where it's exactly, but this was in LA. And I'm like, oh, what's that sign about?
As they
So
have Filipino town there, and you
yeah,
can do a
yeah.
tour of the historic Filipino town. Yes.
Historic Filipino town. I think
Mm.
yeah, that's it.
Mhm. They have
The
one in
last
San Francisco also.
Yeah, yeah, they're quite active, and it's so much presence of the Filipino heritage in the U.S. Just want to touch on one other topic, which is about gender and sexuality. I know this is something that I read in the beginning of the book, and just noting some examples here of those migrant women rejected the ideals of a chaste wife, became pioneers in dismantling traditional constructions of the feminine. So when we talk about the traditional feminine, we know there is like a, Maria Clara, the
Hmm.
ideal wife, housewife, who just stays home and helps out with the husband. But there's so much Filipinas who've managed to change their own perception of how strong Filipinas are. So I know this is something a bit of a controversy on how they've managed to do it, but the title of some of their stories was what is it? Example of the Singaporean. I think she was a maid, or she had several lovers with a wife. What do you call them? A single wife, a childless single wife overseas, or something like that. That they were able to um, kind of normalize their situation, kahit na it's not accepted when you go to the Philippines. You can't do that, but when they go overseas, it becomes like this natural tendency to go into that stage of having lovers even though they're already married. So can you tell us something about that?
Actually, those stories surprised me because you all know it's taboo, right? Men can have girlfriends after they're married, but if a woman does it, it's considered reprehensible, shameful and reprehensible and frowned upon. And it's generally a taboo topic. But the migrant archives did have this from their stories. Of course, they use pseudonyms, but I could see that. What happens is that the migrant situation, far from home, and far from the prying eyes of relatives who police women's sexuality, right? And you're not allowed to go out. Everyone's going to make chismes about you. But if you're in a situation where that doesn't happen, if you're, of course, if you join. the Catholic Church, and that will happen. But it just allows a lot of these women, of course, have husbands who also have mistresses back in the Philippines, right? So I felt as a feminist historian that this empowered them to have sexual desire and express their sexuality in ways that they couldn't in the Philippines and would be taboo in the Philippines, which the migrant context allows. So I don't want to judge these women, but I thought this appeared in the migrant archives, and I thought it was rather fascinating that some articles were also written in the Manila Press in Singapore about how they have romance
Yeah.
and with the sort of South Asian men. So I thought that was quite interesting, and that appears there, and it's a radical thing. I think it's
Indeed.
also radical that women are breadwinners now, right?
Yeah,
They're the ones who
definitely.
decide, and in a way that at the same time that the women are. What I thought was funny and interesting was that memoir from Paris, where the woman said when she had a sexual relationship with a woman, that she wasn't committing adultery because it was not with a man. So that shows you that the definition of sex is still heteronormative sex with between men, and therefore you can have a girlfriend because it's not
Yeah.
contravening. So I thought that was the interesting
Mhm.
story.
No, there's so much in that book. Very interesting topics, and it does radically change your thinking about so many things and the perspective of a migrant. So, thank you for sharing all these migrant stories in your book. I just want to pull in any comments or any questions from Rochelle as well.
I
Um,
do have a question, Mina, and it
yes.
must have been fantastic to interview different perspectives of these different migrants. I had a conversation with my husband who migrated here in Australia when he was 6 years old.
Oh wow,
I
young.
migrated, yeah, I migrated here when I was already an adult, but I grew up in another Western country. But we had a discussion, believe it or not, academic discussion about, I said, it depends on the migrant how, if they will allow themselves to, if they will immerse themselves in the culture or if they
Yes,
will
that's
hang
correct.
on. Have
Yes.
you, can you tell us, share with us what your observation is? Did most of these migrants that you interviewed embrace or immerse themselves in the culture that they entered into, or did they cling on to the Filipino culture? I'm
That's
curious.
a challenge for everybody, and so it depends on the country. So if Italy, the language is a problem, right? They don't speak Italian, so then they stay with other Filipinos, uh, uh, and then of course it depends whether the country you're been in is not open to migrants, and therefore you must assimilate in order to survive. So it depends on the context of the country and what freedom it allows. Now of course there's a lot of them that, but I noticed that they want to keep their Filipino-ness. It's a strand. Even the second, third generation American born there, they're going to. Somebody did a book. Theo Gonzalez did a great book on how Filipinos, college students in the U.S., third generation, spend hundreds of hours learning tinikling. To do a Filipino cultural night. Because they want to express. They're learning. They're not learning Tagalog. They're not just learning Tagalog. They're learning baybayin, the ancient pre-colonial. So some of them, there's this, and they go to the Cordillera and get a tattoo. So there I find that there's a very strong desire to express your Filipino-ness. That's why that best-selling book came out, 300 ways to test if you're Filipino, right? Do you point with your mouth? You see that test? It's very cute. Do you smile for no reason? Do you arrive 30 minutes late? That's very popular with the migrants. And I like the way it says if you get 200 and something, you're 300 something, you're definitely Filipino. And if you got 200 something, you have OFT, obvious Filipino tendencies. So you should just go with the flow and assimilate because resistance is futile. So I find that the migrants like to keep their Filipino-ness, and they connect to the country. So there's Filipinos in Padua who raise, every time there's a typhoon, they raise money. They form Associazione Donne Filippine in Italy to, so they're I find that they want to keep their Filipino-ness. That's very very strong. They do, so the assimilation depends on whether, like in Dubai, they'll never allow them to retire there. Singapore will always want to send them home. Australia allows you to live here. So, but on the other hand, they want us to be really assimilated. Like, when people ask me, where are you from? And I say, Sydney. No, where are you really from? Like, I couldn't possibly be Australian. So, they don't want us to be them. So, of course, you exert your Filipino-ness because you have no other choice. So there is that, but a certain amount of assimilation is necessary for survival, and I think migrants understand that quite well. So there's that
I was
negotiation.
gonna say, I think the word assimilation is very intriguing to me. I know, like, it's got its own kind of interpretation from people. I'd like to use integration, but I can understand how it's all these language are coming together and finding its own use in the contemporary migration experience.
But I think
Yeah.
what Rochelle means is, do they learn to adapt the foreign uh, uh, uh,
Yeah,
cultures?
ways. Do they embrace it? Do they,
Yes, and
Mm.
depends on the Filipino, right? Some of them don't want to, and so there's a lovely book in America about how the parents police the daughters, and in other words, they want them to get married and have children, but they don't want them to date. So you cannot be American at all in any possible way. So and you must marry Filipino. There's that, but then there's also the ones that learn the language, and also, so it's kind of a personal thing, and it also depends on the context of, but I think
Mhm.
more and more there's that push. I met this in Greece. There was this organization that they take Filipinos around to learn about the history of Greece, because most of them just want to buy things to send to the country. And then one of them complained, ano ba to? Mga bato-bato lang to. So they're trying to explain these are ancient Greek ruins, so 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 then so they're so they're some of these organizations are getting the Filipinos there to appreciate Greek history. So I think it depends on the group, also.
Yeah. Anything else, Rochelle, that you want to raise?
No, no, that answers the question. And the person, it really depends on also on the person on whether they embrace or, but it's interesting. What's inspiring is, and it's a great because it's towards the end now.
Yeah.
Because there's the Filipino-ness that they look for, no matter it's not necessarily language, but something in the history. That's actually
Yes,
quite inspiring. It's like in
yes,
their blood,
it
so
is.
they need to feel
Yeah.
connected.
And one of the former presidents of the Filipino American National Historical Society, born in the States, if we don't tell our story, she says, others will tell it for us, and they interpret it, and we will risk losing our essence and the truth about the Filipino American experience. We want to tell the story with our own voices and control it. We don't want the Americans to write about us. So I find this is a real history from below, and the Philip, I find that astonishing, and that's why they're producing, and there's so many of these stories. And when I told I'll do this project, people say, "Oh, here's these stories from Hong Kong. I'll send it to you. Here are these stories from the Middle East." So there's quite a lot of them. And the interviews, of course, are good because they add another level. And hanging around with them, I went to this debutante in Padua where the parents spent $5,000, 5,000 euros. That's the cover of my book. That's her debutante ball, which is made. Now it was made in the Philippines and sent there. But it's very interesting because for me, I find all of them have a kind of, even the Filipino Americans, there's this. This sense of Filipino-ness, like you said, and even when I asked a Filipino American, the founder of the society, how do you define a Filipino American? And he said, one drop of bagong and they're ours. So, you know, in other words, everybody's included here. So that's sort of very interesting. Although it's not all a happy story, because stories from Filipino Japanese children, the daughters of and sons and daughters of Filipino entertainers in Japan, suffer discrimination in the Philippines also.
Wow, that's really good to hear. I mean, yes, so much interesting points. Unfortunately, we're out
All
of our
right.
time, but I think people have tuned in and out. So thank you
It's
for
okay.
your
Thank you
time.
for your time.
Yeah,
Thank you for
it's
listening.
correct. Yeah, as well. If anyone wants to get in touch with Mina, you can drop in some comments here. We'll let her know, or you can message her, or Google her if you want. She's just in Sydney. But I think that would and this will end our broadcast or our live stream. Thank you for your time. If you've got any other interesting points, do let us know. Or if you want to have a chat, yeah, just message us on our Facebook page. It's now Isco and Iskasa at Iskasa Melbourne. Thanks, Mina. Thanks,
Thank
Rochelle.
you for
Have a
having
good
me.
night,
Yeah,
everyone.
thanks,
See ya.
Janica. Good night, everyone.
Maraming salamat po.